Alex and then put it, then it's and then I'll smash everyone in the head.
Okay, first of all, I want to say how grateful I am to be invited to speak here, and I want to congratulate everyone involved in the occupation here. It's an absolutely magnificent development, and it's great to be in this tent, you know, vibrating with church bells and traffic noises and music and so on, and talking about what's wrong with the world in which we live. I'm going to talk more about capitalism and democracy as a general topic, because I think it's important to do that to get to the question of an alternative, which is what we, I think, all want to get to. Because, see, I think the example that Joel gave of Papandreou's abortive referendum is very interesting, because, of course, it was a manoeuvre, a desperate and unsuccessful manoeuvre on its part, but the sheer rage, the fury of Merkel, Sarkozy, the rest of the European Union, the media, was very, very instructive. I mean, here we have a situation in which the Greek economy has been shrinking since 2008, in which they're having austerity programme after austerity programme imposed upon them. Creating really desperate conditions. I have an aunt who lives in a nursing home in Athens, and when I went to see her in September, she told me the staff there hadn't been paid for it yet. I mean, it's incredible. The masters of the world are demanding yet another package of austerity, and yet it's an outrage that the Greek people should be invited to vote on whether they think this is a good idea or not. It's very, very instructive about how the world is actually run. There's the notion that capitalism and democracy go together, but as we've already heard, the reality is extremely different. Now, as Joe has said, the official ideology is insistent that capitalism and democracy dovetail together into a harmonious unity. And that means that China is a real problem, because China is the most dynamic capitalist economy in the world. China is the putative saviour of global capitalism. But China isn't anything, isn't anyone's idea of a democracy. And there's all sorts of worrying, how big a problem is this? Does this mean that Western liberal capitalism is going to be challenged by other kinds of capitalism, or will China become democratic as it's more integrated world economy and so on? And in a sense, the problem is a false one. Because if you look at the history of capitalism, it's happily coexisted with all sorts of undemocratic forms of rule. I mean, we've heard about the colonial experience, not just in the Arab world, of course, but on a global scale. Capitalism has also happily coexisted with slavery, with National Socialism, with apartheid, with military dictatorships. So, to the extent that capitalism coexists with democracy, it's a marriage of convenience. In other words, in certain circumstances, it makes sense for the form of rule, the way in which politics is organised, to take a democratic form. But it doesn't have to be like that. There are other carapaces, other political and institutional setups in which capitalism could perfectly happily operate. But also, to reinforce what's already been said, there's the kind of democracy that capitalism can coexist with is of extremely limited time in several respects. You see, the conception of democracy that Joel was talking about goes back to one of the cleverer defenders of capitalism in the last century, the Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter, who said, don't tell me about democracy, the sovereignty of the people, the social contract, all that kind of stuff. Don't talk to me about Rousseau or anything like that. That kind of democracy is cloud cuckoo land. The only kind of democracy that is viable is one where the voters are passive, and all they do is choose among a number of competing elites who are trying to get off. So, and it's this kind of democracy that we see today in countries like Britain. A democracy where the electorate are required to be passive, are required to express themselves politically only in very rare and limited contexts. I mean, Rousseau, back in the 18th century, said that the English people can't claim to be self-governing because they only get to vote, then it was once every 7 years, and the use that they make of this right shows that they don't deserve to govern themselves. Now, leaving aside the last part, there's a strong sense in which what Rousseau said still applies today. This is a passive democracy, and the competition of elites that Schumpeter has talks about at the political level has become much weaker, because everyone, Cameron, Clegg and Miliband all agree about neoliberalism. The scope for choice is incredibly restricted, but there are other fundamental limitations of this kind of democracy. What it's supposed to cover is simply what's defined as political. This is the separation of economics and politics that Joe was talking about. What this means is that when it comes to electing a government and local councils and so on, we have votes. But with respect to the economy, and this is critical, this is the key presupposition of what we should properly call capitalist democracy, dictatorship reigns. Dictatorship reigns in how financial institutions are run, dictatorship reigns in how companies are run. None of these institutions are accountable either to the people they work for, or to the communities that they're embedded in, or to the people that they deliver goods and services to. Now you get really rubbish arguments that the market is a form of democracy, that voting, that spending money is a I don't know, how many? 20 billion votes. And, how much do we have? 500 votes? 1,000 votes? So this is an incredibly loaded system of decision making. There's democracy, voting, not democracy. There's voting, equal voting when it comes to formal politics, and there's dictatorship when it comes to the economy. Moreover, again, neoliberalism has reinforced this, because one of the things that we see with neoliberalism, the way in which as much as possible decision-making is transferred to supposedly neutral technical experts. So, before Tony Blair became Prime Minister, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, an elected politician, fixed interest rates. So monetary policy was at least notionally controlled by elected politicians. I agree they did it very badly and they weren't very accountable, but at least there was an element of democratic accountability. Now interest rates are set by the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee, which is a bunch of economists and bureaucrats and so on and so forth. And the general trend is more and more to confide policy making to experts. And these experts are supposed to be neutral. Then, the governor of the Bank of England, Mervyn King, has this authority to determine monetary policy because supposedly he knows so much about the economy works. He's just like, someone who fixes aircraft engines or something like that. But this is complete nonsense. Mervyn King worked hand in glove with the Tories before they came to office. Mervyn King campaigned for the adoption of austerity policies. He's a political animal, but increasingly what used to be in the domain of politics is transferred to the rule of experts. And again, we can see this in the Eurozone crisis. When it comes to decision-making over the Eurozone crisis, they talk about the Troika. Who are the Troika? Well, there's the European Commission, which, if you're tremendously kind, you can say it bears some relationship to elected bodies, although it's extremely indirect. Then there's the European Central Bank, which is like the Bank of England, specifically democratically unaccountable. And then there's the International Monetary Fund, which is democratic unaccountability on wheels, squared because of the way in which it's separated from any accountability. So the limited kind of democracy that existed historically under capitalism is having its scope and character radically reduced. What this means is that any serious anti-capitalist project has to be about the radical extension of democracy. And that means two things, crucially. It means, firstly, extending the scope of democratic decision-making. In other words, what companies do, what banks do, what economic policy-making institutions do, should be subject to democratic control. And in many cases, the best form of democratic control would be to essentially socialise, for the community to take over those institutions, so that we don't have the kind of huge concentrations of private economic power that dominate our societies and dominate globally. So we want economic democracy. We want an end to the dictatorship in the economy. Secondly, it means changing the character of decision-making. In other words, ending the kind of democracy which presupposes the passivity of the citizens, presupposes that citizens aren't really citizens, they're just box tickers. Because that's what we are. You think about what voting is like, what voting consists in. And that means trying to develop a democracy that is radically participatory. Now, that's something where we need to think and discuss a lot, because it's okay to talk about participatory democracy, but what it means is something that requires quite a lot of thought. For example, is participatory democracy simply a matter of direct democracy? In other words, people in assemblies coming together and making decisions with no role for representatives of any kind? Or is there scope for forms of delegation which are very strongly accountable to the base assemblies, or whatever you want to call them? That's one important issue. One issue which is, of course, very relevant to projects like this one is how do you take decisions? Do you take decisions by consensus, or do you take decisions by majority, or through a mixture of the two, or whatever? I think they're really important issues to be decided there. I think that all these, in a sense, these different dimensions of a deeper democracy can be packed together in the idea of a self-managing society. In other words, a society which is run by the people who make it up, where economic decisions are, as far as possible, taken at the most basic level in workplaces and in neighbourhoods, and often in cooperation between workplaces and neighbourhoods, and where you get a structure of accountable delegates rising up from the base level, the level of workplaces and neighbourhoods, to take the larger scale decisions that have to be made. But the critical element in this kind of self-managing society weak form of democracy that exists in those societies. So those are some thoughts of mine, really contribution to the kind of debates that we need